biology / chemistry colloquium this week on folding and processing of misfolded proteins that are destined for the mitochondria. So most of the proteins that we've been talking about in this class are membrane proteins, similar to the mitochondrial proteins. And so this is of general interest to the people in this class as well as in cell physiology. Anyway, Thursday, noon, CST 103. As always, there's pizza to feed you while you're That's this Thursday. I have not graded your quizzes yet. I will hope to get them back on Thursday. So today we're going to go over the electrocardiogram a little bit more, and then we're going to talk about blood flow and the Wiggers diagram. So I'm not going to go through all these details here. The Wiggers diagram is an important figure in cardiovascular physiology that students like you have been wrestling with for generations, and they're going to wrestle with it now. So the electrocardiogram, which you saw in lab last week, is an electrical measurement obtained from electrodes placed on the skin of the electrical activity in the heart. And the reason that we can record electrical activity in the heart from electrodes on the skin is that the heart has, in many cases, parts of the heart are propagating electrical signals synchronously, so the signals are pretty large, and your body is a good conductor, including your skin, so that we can record electrical signals on the body, even though the signals are originating from deep within the body. So the idea, so the red lines here represent what's going on in the heart, the spread of depolarization going on in the heart. So let's say, well, I'll draw some cartoons. So the red is what's actually happening in the heart, and the blue lines indicate the direction of a lead that is connected to the skin. So this is lead 1, going across the body like this. So I'm going to need my compass to ask you some questions later on. So when you connect lead 1, you define an axis with a positive direction and a negative direction. I'm not going to draw the negative directions, but a signal that was aligned in this direction would give you a positive result, and a signal that was aligned anti-parallel would give you a negative result. So this is lead 1, and this is the body. So this is the left arm, and this is the right arm. It's the chest. It's really recording from the chest, but we can connect to the wrist or to the shoulder because this is just a conductor. Lead 2 is defines this orientation. Lead 3, when we connect the leads, for lead 3, we define this orientation on the body. So lead 2, lead 3, lead AVF, lead AVR, and lead ABF. And the reason we collect all these leads is because there's some redundancy here. So you can see lead 2 and lead ABF are gathering kind of the same information, but it's sometimes useful to gather information that at slightly different angles. I guess one way to think about it is we have 2 eyes, which allows us to see an image from slightly different perspectives, and that gives us 3-dimensional information about what we're looking at, because we have 2 different points of gathering the information. So 2 different leads, even if they're close, can give us 2 different bits of information about the 3-dimensionality of the electrical signals in the heart. if the lead is parallel to the signal, you get a positive signal. If the lead is perpendicular to the signal, you get no result, because this vector and this vector being perpendicular, there's no component of this signal in this orientation. And in this case, this lead sees the component of this signal that is parallel to it. So the more parallel to the lead, the better the lead is at seeing the signal. If the lead is opposite the signal, you get a negative result. The component that is negative here gives a negative result, that's smaller. And if there's no signal, there's no signal. But there's two ways to get no signal. You can get no signal, and by no signal, I mean no spread of depolarization. We'll see that again in a few minutes. Or you could have a signal, a very big signal, that was perpendicular to the lead, in which case the lead would be blind to that signal. So we're going to use this now to understand the electrocardiogram. You saw it in lab. It might have still been mysterious, but at least I convinced you that you all can see your heartbeats from the limb leads that you connected. So now let's understand it a little better. So here's lead 1, and here's lead AVF. I'm going to illustrate using these two leads. But everything I say can also, I'll sort of ask you some questions about the other leads to try to make it clear. So I'm not going to talk about all 6 of these limb leads. I'm going to talk only about 2 of them. And I'm choosing these two because they're perpendicular to each other, so they provide information about this plane of the 3-dimensional heart pretty well. So when action potentials spread from the sinoatrial node throughout the atria, there's a wave of electrical activity over the surface of the atria, and that wave of depolarization can be sort of condensed into one arrow, right, on average. Time and spatial averaging of that signal produces a vector, something in that orientation. And I think you can believe that spreading from this spot throughout the atria could produce a time and space average that looks something like that arrow. It seems plausible. And so this arrow, now transposed over to here, makes it clear why we see a positive signal in lead 1 and why we see a positive signal in lead AVF. Because there's a component of that vector in both lead 1 and lead AVF. What's your expectation about what we would see in lead 2? First, positive or negative? Positive. You should also be able to see, because you're using the compass, see that that arrow has a component that is at least partially aligned with this vector. Do you suspect that, given this, the signal that we're talking about is going to be bigger in lead 2 than in lead 1? Yes, because it's better aligned with lead 2 than lead 1. Okay, so you're getting the concept here. This spread of depolarization, the spread of depolarization across the atria, which will lead to atrial systole, but hasn't yet because it's still just the electrical spread, remembering that contraction is delayed behind the excitation. We're just looking at excitation, the spread of excitation, and it gives what's called the P wave. And the P wave is positive in lead 1. You just told me it was likely to be positive in lead 2. In this case, it's positive in lead AVF. What do you think it would be in AVR in this case? Negative. We'd get a negative signal in lead AVR. What do you think you'd see in lead 3? maybe tiny. I think the operational, it would be small. It might be small positive, it might be small negative, it might be 0, because it's pretty close to perpendicular to lead 3. What do you, so this is the spread of atrial depolarization. Why didn't we see the spread of depolarization in the SA node that got this started in the first place? Michael? There is a direction. It spreads in the SA node with you can always make a time and space average. Too small. The SA node is too small to see on this. The signal is just too small to see on electrodes connected to the skin. If we put an electrode in the atria right next to the SA node, we'd probably see it. But that's an invasive procedure, and that's not what we're talking about here. Okay, so now you understand the P wave. Why does it go back to 0 after the spread of depolarization has completed? Why does it go from 0 to positive and back to 0? Why is it a hump and not just a up and stay up? Simon? Is your hand?
Kind of.
Okay.
The charge is no longer, like it's telling it to depolarize and then it's repolarizing.
Okay, so it's depolarizing and then repolarizing. Okay, you're getting on the right track, but that doesn't say it exactly right. Joey?
I don't know anymore now.
You don't know anymore now. What, I said something that killed you? I killed your answer?
I'll just say it. So I was thinking because like when they're first coming in and it reaches the threshold, then it gets a little bit higher, that like point, I guess.
No, it doesn't have to do with that little spiky thing at the top of the action potential. It's got nothing to do with that. Grant?
Is it the fiber screens combined with the delay of the AV node?
That's the answer. So the action potential does not spread from the atria into the ventricles except at the AV node. What is special about the AV node? It's small and it's slow. So the spread of depolarization after the spread of depolarization across the atrial muscle is going through a small piece of tissue. And so after the spread of depolarization, when the depolarization is complete, we no longer have anything moving. Well, no longer anything moving that we can see. It's moving through the AV node, and then it's going to move into the ventricles. But it goes back to 0 because for a while there, remember the AV node slows it down. There's a delay between atrial systole and ventricular systole. It's moving through the AV node, too small to see. Signal's too small, back to 0. Remember, this is not contraction, this is not depolarization. This is the spread of depolarization. This is the movement of depolarization. Okay, so it goes back to 0 during the, what's called the PR segment. So this interval represents the delay between atrial electrical signals and ventricular electrical signals that are coming up next because of slow, small depolarization through the AV node. Okay, then it goes through the bundle of His. What if? The depolarization spreads through the bundle of His, the bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers, and those are all too small to see with the surface electrodes. If we put an electrode, if we introduce an electrode, and we can do this by catheter through the, let's say, the superior vena cava into the right ventricle, we could put an electrode right there, and then we would see this spread because we're right up next to it. But with the surface, it's too small to see. So after AV nodal spread, bundle of His, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers, and then into ventricular muscle. And what part of the ventricular muscle, now we're talking about big piece of muscle, what part of the ventricular muscle depolarizes and contracts first? The septum. And the contraction of the septum, the excitation of the septum, remember there was that signal in that movie I played, and it was spreading from here, sort of across here first? That spread is represented by that signal. And it's big because the interventricular septum has a lot of muscle, a lot of mass. So in lead 1, what do we see? A pretty big, a big-ish negative signal. Because it should be clear why this spread of depolarization, it's spreading from left to right, and it's pretty big because we're in the ventricular muscle, why this spread gives a negative signal in lead 1. Is that clear for everybody? That should be very clear. What is it in lead AVF?
Positive.
Small positive, real small positive, because it's almost perpendicular. What is it in lead 2? Negative.
Small negative.
Maybe small negative, because it's, if anything, it's negative. Okay, so you've got the right idea. Lead 3, probably positive. So this depolarization of the septum is the first step in the so-called QRS complex, which is the spread of depolarization across the ventricles. So right now we're talking about Q or R, and so this is always very confusing. Why in lead 1 is it Q, and why in lead AVF is it R? Same signal, it's got a different name. It's the same signal. Septal depolarization. And this is just one of the idiosyncrasies of the electrocardiogram, which I will not test you on, but just so you know. The QRS complex is the spread of ventricular depolarization. But by definition, the Q wave is a negative signal, and the R wave is a positive signal. So if you don't see a negative signal, you don't have a Q wave. You still have a QRS complex, because we're going to get an R signal, but we don't have a Q component of the QRS complex here, but we do here. That's why. So I am not going to ask you details about Q versus R versus S. We're going to lump it all together into QRS. Kendra? So let's go on, let's do the QRS complex. So what happens after depolarization spreads throughout the septum? Where does the depolarization go next? Apex. The apex is the biggest, meatiest, most muscular part of the heart. So the next signal is going to be really big. The biggest signal in the whole thing we're talking about here is the peak of the QRS complex. You should see why it's positive in lead 1 and why it's positive in lead AVF. Is it positive in lead 2? Yes. Is it bigger in lead 2 than in lead 1? Yes, typically. What is it in lead AVR? Negative. In this case, the QRS complex, the biggest peak of the QRS complex is negative, and we wouldn't call it an R wave, we would call it a Q wave, because it's negative, but that's aside. The biggest peak of the QRS complex in lead AVR is negative. Everybody clear on why it's negative? And it's still big. It's a big negative signal in lead AVR. Apex. Big depolarization spreading towards the apex. The spike of the QRS complex. What's next? It spreads throughout the ventricular walls. It spreads throughout the right and the left ventricular wall. Which is bigger, left or right? Left. Which is a lot bigger, left or right? left. The left is a lot bigger, so the component of spreading in the left side dominates way dominates over what spreads in the right side, and we get a vector something like this. So is it positive in lead 1? Yeah, and but you can see, you should be able to see why it's less positive in lead 1 than this signal. A, this signal is bigger, and B, this signal is better aligned in lead 1 than this signal. So it's smaller than it was before, which is why it's coming down. If it goes negative, we call it an S wave. QRS. So we've finished the QRS complex. Apical depolarization, septal depolarization, apical, apex depolarization, and then wall, but dominated by the left wall. In both cases, we're going back to baseline. That's where we're going to go next. Why does it go back to baseline now? After all of this depolarization, what happens? After all of this spread of depolarization, what is going on right now in this ECG? Kendra? We're not done with this beat yet. We are not done with this beat yet. We're going to start repolarization, but not yet. Remember, this is the spread of depolarization. This is the spread of depolarization. Michael? All of the muscle has depolarized and is in the process of contracting. We are in ventricular systole now. So the QRS complex represents the onset of ventricular systole. But after it is all depolarized, there's no longer any more spread. And so there's no longer any more electrical signal. Is the heart at rest? No, the heart is doing its work now. So this is the interesting thing here. Is the heart at rest here before the P wave? Yes. This is before this beat has started. What's going on here? The atria are contracting, but the ventricles are not yet contracting. And what's going on here is the atria are repolarizing and the ventricles are contracting. Why don't we see the repolarization of the atria? Because you'll see in a minute. Hold that thought. So this baseline is very different from this baseline, which is very different from this baseline. You should be able to understand the differences, even though they're all there's nothing on the ECG. Okay, so now the heart is contracting, and we're at baseline. In all cases. No more spread of electrical activity, but the heart's not at rest, it's working. Clear? So what's going to happen next? What happens after the spread of depolarization? Repolarization. And the spread of repolarization produces a vector something like this. And why isn't the spread of repolarization just sort of a reverse, reverse playback of the QRS complex, the spread of depolarization? Because the spread of repolarization is less well organized than the spread of depolarization. Repolarization doesn't use the bundle branches, the bundle of His, the Purkinje fibers. Repolarization is just sort of from outside to inside, and repolarization produces a vector like this. It's not a replay of the spread of depolarization. The spread of repolarization is different. And so you can see, even the spread of ventricular muscle is a small hump. You should be able to see why it's positive in lead 1 and slightly positive in lead AVF. In this case, it should be bigger in lead 1 than in lead AVF. You should be able to see why it's bigger in lead 1 than in AVF. What direction is it in lead AVR? Negative. What direction is it in lead 3? Maybe slightly negative. It's hard to say. Too small to say. It's small. So even though the ventricles are big, this repolarization is small because the spread of repolarization is less well organized, less directional than the spread of depolarization. So now it should be clear why the spread of repolarization of the atria is invisible. Repolarization is less well organized, and the atria are smaller than the ventricles. So if this little signal is what the ventricles give us, then during the spread of atrial repolarization, it's too small to see. So we don't see atrial repolarization. We do see ventricular repolarization. In what state is the heart here after ventricular repolarization? Relaxing. Is that what you said? Relaxing?
Yes.
Yeah. Relaxing, it's starting to relax, it's starting to refill. Because, I mean, maybe not just yet, but eventually we're going to start to relax and refill. Questions about any of this material? This now is my level of wanting you to understand the ECG. If you become a cardiologist, you will understand more nuances of the ECG that are obviously not appropriate at this level. Okay.
You want us to understand all 6 of those points? Yeah.
I would like you to be able to reproduce that diagram because you'll need it to answer problems. I won't ask you to just draw the diagram, but I might ask you, I might say, okay, the T wave is big positive in lead 2. What is it in AVR? And you should be able to answer that question by knowing what positive and negative mean. I think it will be helpful for the exam to be able to reproduce that compass because it will allow you to answer questions. Yes?
If the lead and the signal are perpendicular, what is the result again?
No signal. So for example, the P wave, let's go back to the P wave. Let me give you an example, Acacia. The P wave. The P wave. Pretty perpendicular to lead 3. Almost 0 in lead 3. You would see a tiny, if any, P wave. That doesn't mean the P wave's not happening. That doesn't mean atrial depolarization is not happening. It means that atrial depolarization is invisible to lead 3 in this case. There's the signal. There's the signal perpendicular-ish to lead 3. Everybody with me? You're going to be using this on the problem set. So by the way, there's a hard copy of the problem set, which is due this Sunday at CST. So you're going to be using this knowledge to, and hopefully cementing your knowledge of this material when you work with the problem set. And remember, the problem set's open book, and you can work with each other. Just turn in your own answers. Yeah?
Can you go back to the first slide?
This one? The very first slide?
What did you say about the second one?
The reason, okay, so the reason why, let me just draw the P wave here. The vector of the P wave. So let's say the vector of the P wave is like that. That's an exaggeration size. That P wave is generating a vector like that, let's just say. So it's going to be bigger in lead 2 than in lead 1 because it is aligned with lead 2, but only this component of it, well, I drew it so big that it doesn't work, but well, let's do AVL. It's going to be big in lead 2, and only this component of it is aligned with lead AVL. So it will be much bigger in lead 2 than in lead AVL. The signal is the same, the signal, what's going on in the heart is the same, but what you see in lead 2 is bigger than what you see in lead AVL.
So it's still positive and not as big?
The way I drew it, it would still be positive, but almost zero. I mean, it would be not as big, nowhere near as big. The way I drew it. So let's draw another one. Let's do this again. And this gets to a point where I need to remind myself, to remind you, that not all hearts are the same. There's individual variation. You saw that in the lab. So the QRS complex is usually in this orientation, like this. But there are individuals where it's very horizontal. The spread of, because of the position of the heart, because of the way the heart is put together, the muscle, where the muscle is, the QRS complex might be a signal that looks like this. Okay, in some individual. Natural variation. It's usually like this, but in some people it can be oriented like that. That's still perfectly normal. So, is the QRS complex big, positive in lead 1? Yes. Is the QRS complex bigger in lead 1 than in lead 2, in this case?
Yes.
Yes. In this case it would be. Is the QRS complex visible to lead 3? Yes. Negative. Small negative. Is this vector, is this depolarization visible to lead AVF? No, perpendicular. So that's why, that's the kind of information all these different leads give us. Is it as big in lead AVL as it is in lead 1? No, it's smaller in lead AVL because we only see this component of it rather than the whole thing. When I draw this line up, you can say, well, why don't you just draw the line like that, or why don't you draw the line like that? I'm doing what they call in physics dropping the perpendicular. I'm making a right angle here. That's why I draw that line. Did that answer your question? So this is the way, this is not the ECG that you recorded in lab last week, but this is a typical ECG. Leads 1, 2, and 3. Leads 1, 2, and 3. Whoops. Leads 1, 2, and 3 are being recorded at the same time. So this beat and this beat are the same beat, being recorded from 2 different leads. So lead 1, 2, and 3, and V1, one of the precordial leads that we haven't talked about a lot at all, is recorded at the same time. Lead AVR, AVL, AVF, and V1 are recorded at the same time. Lead V1, V2, and V3, and V1. This signal right here is exactly the same as this signal right here. So you're going to be working with this in the problem set. A couple of notes. Notice that sometimes there's a spike here. What is that spike? What is that signal right there that's visible in this lead, this lead, this lead, but not in this lead? It's a blip. What is that blip result of? The switch, the electrical switch from 3 to AVF, from 2 to AVL, from 1 to AVR. So don't pay attention to these blips. They all look like blips to you, but you'll figure out which blips you need to pay attention to and which blips you don't. This blip is the switch blip. This blip is the heartbeat. Okay, so you'll work with it on the problem set. Happy to answer questions between now and Sunday. Let's do a clicker. So this is just a series of true-false questions. Which of these are true statements about ECG? Give you a direct hint, 2 correct answers. Okay, for those of you who are showing me your answers, you're all getting it right. Let me just clarify. So the limb leads are defining this plane, and the precordial leads, when they do all 12, we're only talking about 6 here, but when they do all 12, they wrap around this way. So they give information about the horizontal plane. So the limb leads give you information about the vertical plane, and the precordial leads give you information about the horizontal plane. So you have a 3-dimensional set of information. We're not going to talk about precordial, but the point is the P wave is not invisible to all the precordial leads. It's 3-dimensional. So there would be a P wave in lead B. Well, let's just see. Do we see a P wave in lead B1? Okay, let's do another one. Another set of true false. Several correct answers here. I'm going to give you less of a hint. More than one. That's my hint. A and C. Good. No, wait, why is B? Yeah, that's B is correct. I got this wrong. I got my own clicker. B is correct. The QRS complex is seen in limb leads, but not precordial leads. Wait a second. So let's go back to the electrocardiogram. The QRS complex is certainly seen in this precordial lead. So C is a true statement. Am I reading it right?
What
The
is
QRS complex is seen in limb leads, but not precordial leads.
But it is.
But it is seen, so B is a true statement.
No.
No, which means it's false.
B is a false statement, right? B is a false statement. B is a false statement. I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong with me. B is a false statement. The QRS complex is seen in limb leads and precordial leads. Gotcha. So A and C are correct statements. I got it right before, and I got myself worked into some sort of weird loop. So don't do what I did. Okay, I think there's one more. This one. maybe one more after this. Which of the following are true statements about the ECG? Okay, I didn't teach this. I didn't teach some of this material, so let me just teach it. Let me use this. Let's go through it one at a time. Is A a true statement? Yes. B is a true statement. B is a true statement. The repolarization spreads from epicardium to endocardium. It spreads, the repolarization spreads from outside to inside. And so I see Grant shaking his head and saying, but wait, the vector is going from inside to outside. But remember, this is the spread of repolarization. So repolarization spreading from out to in is the same as depolarization spreading from in to out, which is what you were thinking. On the T wave is normally positive in lead 2. Yeah. On the ECG, ventricular systole is the period from the beginning of the QRS complex to the end of the T wave. Yeah. From the QRS complex represents the beginning of systole, and the T wave represents the end of systole. So from the beginning of the QRS complex to the end of the T wave is the representation of systole on the ECG. Is pressure high? Thank you. Is pressure high during all of that time? No, because pressure delays after the QRS complex, but we still call it systole. Okay, so now let's transition away from electrical signals and talk about blood flow throughout the heartbeat. So now we're going to apply what you know and talk about blood flow. So I'm using a figure from your textbook, but I'm starting it at a different point. So let me just start it here. This is diastole. The heart is relaxed and refilling. The mitral valve and the tricuspid valve, so annotate your slide here. This is representing the state of the mitral and tricuspid, the bicuspid and tricuspid valve. And this is representing the state of the semilunar valves, aortic and pulmonary. Bicuspid, tricuspid, aortic and semilunar, aortic and pulmonary semilunar. If you wanted to lump it down, you'd say these are the AV valves and these are the semilunar valves. Okay, so make sure you know which is which. So during diastole, the heart, the blood is refilling from the body, the right ventricle is filling, and from the lungs, the left ventricle is filling. The AV valves are open, and the semilunar valves are closed. Why is the AV valve, why are the AV valves open? What opened this valve, and what opens this valve? Pressure. The pressure is higher in the atria than in the ventricles, and that opens this valve. Why is the pulmonary semilunar and the aortic semilunar closed? Why are they closed?
There's less pressure in the ventricles.
Pressure. The pressure is higher, the residual pressure from the previous beat is higher in the aorta than in the ventricles. So this arrow, what is this arrow representing? Is blood actually flowing? This is a confusing arrow. Is blood actually flowing here? No. This arrow is a virtual arrow. It's the arrow that this blood would flow if this valve wasn't preventing it. And that's the same with this. Is blood flowing? Is this arrow a real arrow? No. This arrow is the arrow that blood would flow if we didn't have a closed pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay, so annotate your slide to make it clear that this is actual flow, and this is not flow. This is actual flow, and this is not flow. Okay? Not so clear from the figure. I think the book, the text walks you through it, but the figure is unclear. This flow, this backflow, is what closes this pressure differential, is what closes the the aortic semilunar valve, and this backflow is what closes the pulmonary semilunar valve and prevents the flow. Okay, so let's go. So what's the first step of the heartbeat after diastole ends? Well, atrial systole. So the atria contract and pump some blood. The atria contract and pump some blood. This dotted line is trying to illustrate that the right atrium has contracted. Well, there's a dotted line right there. You can barely see it. So both atria have contracted, and so a little bit of blood has been pumped from atria to ventricles, Now, some of you could say, why do we bother with this? The ventricles got all kinds of blood flow during diastole. What do we need the atria for? It's a good question. We don't really need atrial systole because we get plenty of blood filling during diastole. My mother has atrial fibrillation. Her atria are not beating, but she's still walking around because she's getting plenty of blood filling during diastole. She doesn't have the energy that she used to have. She can't walk as fast as she used to walk for many reasons, but including that her refilling is impaired by about 20% compared to somebody who would have an atrial beat. So the atrial beat contributes about 20% of the ventricular filling. So my mom's at 80% of normal. She's living, but she doesn't have a complete heartbeat. And she feels it. It's weird. It feels weird. Questions about what's going on here? So this is, again, this is not flow, and this is not flow. This is flow, and this is flow. Clear? Okay, so now we have the start of ventricular systole. So the atria have contracted, and maybe your book says, okay, now they've gone through relaxation. So the atria have already contracted and relaxed. And the ventricles are just getting started contracting. What closes, so you can see now, the AV valves are closed. What closes these AV valves? Pressure. The increase in pressure of the ventricles, this backflow, if it happened, but the increase in pressure is what closes the AV valves. The semilunar valves have not yet opened. All valves are closed. We have contraction, but no flow. No flow, no flow, no flow, no flow. No flow, and yet there's contraction going on. So it's called isovolumetric. Iso means the same as. So the volume is staying the same, but the contraction is going on. Isovolumetric because all valves are closed, no flow. We're going to walk through this slide and then take the break. Okay, so stay with me and we'll take a break. Everybody clear why this is no flow, this is no flow, this is no flow, and this is no flow? All the valves are closed. These valves, which used to be open, have been closed by this increase in pressure. And these valves, which were closed, are still closed. When the pressure in the ventricles gets big enough, it opens the exit valves, the semilunar valves. So this is no flow because the tricuspid valve is closed. This is no flow because the mitral valve is closed. But this is now ejection. These two are flow, because the pressure has gotten big enough to open these exit valves, the semilunar valves. And now we have flow. This is output from the right ventricles into the pulmonary circulation, and from the left ventricle into the aortic circulation. Okay? I said we were going to take a break, but we're going to do 2 more of these, and then we'll take a break. So after the contraction is complete, the ventricles start to relax again, right? After the spread of depolarization and after the contraction is complete, they start to repolarize and relax. Now the pressure in the ventricles is dropping. When the pressure drops, the tendency for backflow closes the semilunar valve. The tendency for backflow closes the aortic valve. So this is no flow. These valves are still closed, still no flow. No flow anywhere. It's relaxing, but it's called isovolumetric relaxation. It's relaxing, but there can be no change in volume because all the valves are closed. Isovolumetric relaxation. And then finally, the ventricles relax to the point where the pressure, so let me back up. What is the pressure here greater than the pressure here during isovolumetric relaxation? I'm trying to point to it because I know on the video the laser doesn't show so well. Which has greater pressure at this instant in time? The ventricles or the atria? Ventricles, because the pressure is closing the AV valves. Which has greater pressure? The left ventricle or the aorta at this moment in time? The aorta, because the pressure is closing the semilunar valve. But eventually, this relaxes to the point where the pressure in the atria, which have been filling with blood, is now greater than the pressure in the ventricles, and we're back to diastole. Flow, no flow. Refilling through the open AV valves, no backflow through the closed semilunar valves. Okay, let's take a break and we'll do the wiggers after the break.
At 140.
I got a good question. Grant mentioned, okay, what's closing, let's go back. What's closing the AV valves is pressure. And what's opening the AV valves is pressure. What role do the Purkinje fibers and the Corti tendineae play? Do the Purkinje fiber, not Purkinje, what did I say? Papillary muscle. I think somebody mislabeled the figure just like I just did. What role do the papillary muscle and the Corti tendineae play in this process? You could say the question another way. Do the papillary muscles open the valves? No. Do the papillary muscles close the valves? No. But the papillary muscles and the Corti tendineae prevent these little flaps from blasting out the other way. So this pressure right here this pressure is big. We're talking about a lot of pressure. The heart is strong. And this pressure is very low. So these valves are there's a big pressure differential closing these valves. If you didn't have papillary muscle and chordae tendineae, these valves would blast open this way, and you would have regurgitation, which is not good and leads to, it's a murmur. At best, it's a murmur, and at worst, you have lots of regurgitation from ventricle into atrium. So, the bottom line, the papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae prevent prolapse, backwards flow, and keep the AV valves closed when they need to be closed. Okay? Everybody good with that? Thank you for the question. So let's do the Wigger's diagram. This is a figure from your book, which you can't, I printed it as big as I could, and it's still invisible. So the book does a really good job of walking through this with a cartoon of the heartbeat and the Wigger's diagram. And it walks you through, so point 1, what's going on at point 1, and what's going on at point 2, and what's going on at point 3, and what's going on here at point 4. The book walks you through it with these, marks on the Wigger's diagram, but you can't see it on the handout, and you can barely see it on the screen. So what I'm going to do instead is walk through. I'm going to walk through the Wigger's diagram using a site that is here. And I'll show you what it looks like if you actually go to the link. During the break, I was able to load it. So I'm just going to play it. So you can see a cartoon of the heart, diastole and systole, valves opening and closing, blood pumping and unpumping. Let's just look at the cartoon. Filling, contraction, and pumping. Filling, contraction, and pumping. Let's do it on the left side. Filling, contraction, and pumping. Okay, so the cartoon has the different phases of the heart. And then this green line represents where we are at any moment in time in the heartbeat. Okay? So rather than walk through, we can stop it at any point. So I'm just going to randomly stop it. And, well, that was the random. I'm not sure if it's the best example. But here we are at the interval. Well, we're right at isovolumetric relaxation. And then we'll understand why it's isovolumetric when we walk through it. But rather than walk through the video, I'm just going to walk through what's on the PowerPoint, which are snapshots at strategic times of that video. I stopped it, took a screenshot. So let's just walk through it at these strategic times. So here we are. This is where we are during diastole. We're at the end of one heartbeat and before the beat. We're after one heartbeat and then before the next heartbeat. So we're in diastole. What do I see here? I see here that the volume of the ventricle, so I'm looking at the red line, the volume of the ventricles are low because they have just pumped, but they haven't yet started to refill. Did I get that right?
I think you did pressure.
Oh, this is pressure, right. The volume of the ventricle is high because they have refilled, because they are refilling. Let me do that again. The pressure in the ventricle is low because it is relaxed. The volume has refilled. This is just where the starting point is. We have not yet fired the next P wave. We're during diastole. the heart sounds, which I'll parse out maybe on Tuesday, no, on Thursday, are silent. So these squiggles are supposed to represent the sound that you hear with the stethoscope, and this line represents no sound. So no sound, no electrical signal because we're at rest before the next beat, low pressure, pretty high volume. We have refill. Okay? Let's go to the next slide. So now, we're here. The P wave has fired. We see the P wave. Ventricular volume is high. Atrial pressure is starting to go up. The heartbeat is starting. Ventricular volume is high. Ventricular pressure is still low because we haven't contracted the ventricles yet. So we're starting to contract the atria. We have not yet done anything to the ventricles. This period here is atrial systole. We're at the beginning of atrial systole now. Atrial systole. We're still in atrial systole. Ventricular volume has gone up a little bit because we pumped some blood from atria to the ventricles. This should actually be a little bit more different than it is, but it's okay. Some blood was pumped from atria to the ventricles. We have fired, the P wave is done, but the QRS complex has not yet started. We are still in atrial systole. Okay, so we've got two spots in atrial systole. Now the next one. The QRS complex has happened. Ventricular contraction has started. See, the green line and the red line are almost superimposed. So ventricular pressure is starting to increase very quickly. Why? Because the muscle has depolarized and is starting to contract. Depolarized, starting to contract and generate pressure. It has closed the AV valves, but it has not yet opened the semilunar valves. So there's pressure, but no flow, no change in volume. No change in volume, pressure is increasing, isovolumetric contraction. Electrical, pressure, volume. So to see why it's isovolumetric, you would say, okay, pressure is increasing, pressure is high right here, but volume hasn't changed. This dark blue line represents isovolumetric contraction. Eventually, the pressure in the ventricles exceeds the pressure in the aorta and the pressure in the pulmonary trunk, opens the valves. Now we have the beginning of ejection. Pressure is high. Volume is starting to decrease because we're pushing the blood out. Electrical, we're at the baseline because there's no longer any spread of depolarization, but we're not relaxed. The heart is pumping. Volume is coming down. This is rapid ejection. Let's just see what the next one is. So these two lines here, I'm going backwards and forwards, is representing two different snapshots in rapid ejection. Volume is falling, pressure is high. The green line, this green line, represents aortic pressure. This red line represents ventricular pressure. Is the red line supposed to be slightly above? It's hard to tell. Is the red line supposed to be slightly above or slightly below the green line? Below? If we're going to pump from ventricle to aorta, the pressure in the ventricles has to be greater than the pressure in the aorta. So this red line should be, it shows it right there. The red line is slightly above the green line, but then they become superimposed. So at least during this period right here, during rapid ejection, the pressure in the left ventricle is greater than the pressure in the aorta, and the pressure in the right ventricle, which we're not paying attention to, is greater than the pressure in the pulmonary trunk, because that's how you get flow. Okay? Rapid ejection. The animation goes through a period of reduced ejection, which you can just skip. Cardiologists talk about rapid ejection and slow ejection, rapid ejection or reduced ejection. The point is, there is ejection, and it starts with a rapid phase. All we have to think about is ejection. So when is the blood, by ejection, I mean ejection of blood. As long as the pressure in the left ventricle is greater than the pressure in the aorta, we're going to get ejection. And as long as we're going to get ejection, the volume is going to decrease. So that's the way to think about ejection. Rapid ejection, slow ejection. Clear? So isovolumetric, volume not changing. Rapid ejection, slow ejection. We're sort of walking through it, looking at different lines. This is the challenge of the Wigger's diagram. It has a ton of information superimposed all on one figure. So in some way it's very informative, but it's a challenge to figure out what part to look at if you have to answer a question. Well, let's not do clickers yet, because I think I have a bunch of clickers afterwards. So after ejection, what happens? The pressure in the ventricles, we start to relax the ventricles. The pressure in the ventricles falls below the pressure in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So the semilunar valves close. But the AV valves have not yet opened. Isovolumetric contraction. How can we see isovolumetric relaxation? Volume is not changing. Pressure is coming way down. Pressure is coming down. Volume is not changing. What triggered the decrease in pressure? Relaxation. What triggered the relaxation? Repolarization. T-wave represents the signal that precedes isovolumetric relaxation. So repolarization, relaxation, but we haven't opened any valves yet. See how I'm walking through it? And then we get to, well, so it's the same thing. Relaxation, isovolumetric, having repolarized. And you can see where we're going to go next. What valves are opening right now? And what valves have opened? What valves open when we trigger the transition from isovolumetric relaxation to rapid refilling? The AV valves have opened. And so now blood is flowing from atria to ventricles, and the ventricles are refilling. Pressure is low. We haven't beat a heart, and the heart hasn't started beating yet, so we don't see, we're in diastole. So refilling and diastasis are really both parts of diastole. I don't use this word, so don't worry about this word. Diastole is when the ventricular muscle is relaxed. So your challenge is to walk through this using the textbook and the different points. Point 1, it'll show you the heart. Point 2, it'll show you a cartoon of the heart. Part 3, it'll say pressure. It talks about pressure, and so if I want you to look at pressure, you're looking at the red hump. Pressure low, isovolumetric, ejection, isovolumetric relaxation. Refill. If you want to look at volume, you look at the white line here. Volume is high, ejection, refilling. Isovolumetric, etc. So walking through this is part of your challenge for learning how to do it. And the homework will help you do that. As long as we have a few minutes, let me tell you about the sounds. Because this is something you're interested in. You can hear the heartbeat. So the normal sounds are S1 and S2. Sound 1 and sound 2. Sound 3 and 4 are not completely normal, and you don't often hear them. So let's focus. What's happening that causes sound 1? And I'll give you a hint. It has to do with valves. What valves are changing at this point in time? The aortic and semilunar valves are opening. And what else is, well, at this point in time, which valves are closing? So I should give you a hint. The sounds are the sounds of valves closing. We don't hear valves opening normally. We normally only hear valves closing. And why is that? Well, the valves snap shut, and that snap, muffled by the chest, becomes a boom. So, boom is the sound. Boom. What valves are closing here? Mitral and the tricuspid valves are closing here. What valves are closing here? Aortic and the semilunar valves. So this is the AV valves closing, and this is the semilunar valves closing. So you can see the time. So how would we, let's look at systole. How would we measure systole? Well, if we have an electrocardiogram, we would measure it from the beginning of the QR. When I say systole and I don't say anything else, I'm talking about ventricular systole. How would we measure ventricular systole? Well, if we have an electrocardiogram, we would measure it from the beginning of the QRS complex to the end of the T wave. That's how we would measure ventricular systole electrically. If we have a pressure measurement in the heart, we would measure it from the beginning of isovolumetric contraction to the end of isovolumetric relaxation. If we have a flow meter, we would measure it from the beginning of rapid ejection to the end, well, to the beginning, really, of rapid refilling. We don't usually have it, unless you have like a Doppler echocardiogram. We don't measure flow or volume. If you have sounds, which you have just listening, systole is from the beginning of the S sound to the beginning of the S1 sound to the S2 sound. And there's no beginning and end. It's a snap, and it's another snap. Boom, 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 boom. So there's a whole bunch of clickers, which we're not going to go through, obviously, but it'll be available on Moodle. I recommend walking through the textbook. The textbook has a good explanation of this. If you don't have the textbook, I don't want to know, but there is a copy on reserve here at CSC. This is a case where I really recommend using the textbook. Using the Moodle, the PowerPoint on Moodle, using the video, and then using the clickers to check your knowledge. I haven't even read the question, so I'm not going to answer your question, Josh. But there's a whole series of clickers, and they always have an answer afterwards. So use the clickers to test your knowledge.